Hi, I'm Izzy Grenett. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we will be talking about the 1960s and 1970s. The 1960s were an important time. There was the Cold War, Vietnam, a rising tide of conservatism and racism, but people most often forget that the environmental movement started during this time. As many of you know, pollution heavily exists today and is why global warming is such an issue. We do try our best to recycle, to conserve water, etc., but prior to the 19th century, few Americans took action to protect the natural environment or to conserve natural resources. After World War II, America had entered an uninterrupted economic boom. This meant production was up, consumer goods were up, and America was glad to have left the Great Depression and the war. This great boom, however, was contaminating the air, water, and creating an environmental disaster. Now, before I begin talking about the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s, I'd like to introduce to the audience a historical figure, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was the catalyst to the movement. Basically, the majority of people hadn't noticed the destruction of the environment until Carson had published Silent Spring in 1962. Her controversial book let the public know of the harmful effects of overusing pesticides such as DDT. Her writing created a spark that ultimately launched the movement through concerns of the public and also the government. Thanks to Carson, within 6 months of the publication of Silent Spring, Congress passed the Clean Air Act of 1963. This is the first federal law to regulate air pollution in the U.S. The act set emission standards for power plants and other industrial polluters. However, the law did not address mobile sources of pollutants like cars and trucks, which were a significant part of the air pollution problem. By 1964, as the feel of America began to change, the Wilderness Act was passed, which is the landmark legislation that created the National Wilderness Preservation System. Ultimately, about 50 million acres of land came under federal control as a way of putting them aside and protecting them to oversee wildlife protection. Later, to eventually solve the air pollution caused by transportation, the 1965 Motor Vehicle Pollution Control Act was passed, which added emission limits on cars and trucks. The same year, the Water Quality Act passes and enhances the federal control over water quality. As an outcome of the 1964 Wilderness Act that we discussed before, it quickly became clear to people that simply conserving natural areas was insufficient. So, in 1966, Congress passes the Endangered Species Preservation Act, which expanded federal intervention in the protection of the endangered species of wildlife and their habitats. Let's go to the thought bubble. A tremendous event that really drew the nation to the movement was the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. The Union Oil Company had a drilling platform off of the Santa Barbara coast in California. While replacing a drill bit, about 200,000 gallons of crude oil smeared out, creating 35 miles of coastline with black tar. It turned out the federal government had given Union Oil permission to cut corners on safety, thinking that this was really not that big of a deal, but it was. Cruel images of the tides bringing in corpses of seals, dolphins, and birds appeared on media everywhere. The Union Oil president said, "I don't like to call it a disaster because there was no loss of human life. I'm amazed at the publicity of the loss of a few birds." This did not sit very well with the public, and inevitably the publicity again skyrocketed. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So because of this and other events, Congress created the National Environment Policy Act in 1969. Also, important and major amendments were constantly added to original acts like the Clean Air Act in 1970, the Clean Water Act in 1972, and the Endangered Species Act in 1973, all acts being discussed. Although improvement had later begun to show, there were still issues like in 1978 when residents of New York found toxic waste that was deposited in the 1940s and 1950s bubbling up in their yards. And in the following year, there had been a partial meltdown at a nuclear power facility plant in Pennsylvania. These series of events led to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency's Superfund program to clean up toxic sites. These laws and their updates overall brought environmental regulation to many areas of American life, from the preservation of animals and plants to the reduction of pollution from automobiles. Today, legislation from the 1960s and 1970s are often overlooked. We drive hybrid cars and recycle routinely, but there are new environmental issues that pop up. Organizations and holidays like the popular Earth Day are ways to stay active in the health of our environment. The first Earth Day was celebrated nationwide on April 22, 1970 by a coalition of conservationists and organizations who wanted to bring attention to environmental problems. Since then, Earth Day has had a huge impact. According to NBC News, the EPA says aggregate emissions of 6 major air pollutants have dropped more than 60% since 1980. Only about a third of the American water was safe for swimming or fishing before the passage of the Clean Water Act, so today that proportion has risen to about 2/3. And the bald eagle, a national symbol, became a poster child for the environmental protection since it was near extinction before the Endangered Species Act was passed. In conclusion, the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s was important in ensuring that the environment was habitable for future generations like us. Without the acts and laws passed to protect nature, the conditions of our Earth today could have been significantly different. Millions of acres of wilderness was saved, air, water, and pesticide pollution was reduced, nuclear power development halted, public consciousness was raised, and powerful organizations were built. Crash Course was made with the help of these websites. So thank you again for watching.